Regardless of whether you like it or not, Pokemon has built a solid foundation on releasing games in pairs with slight differences between the two, incentivizing people to buy both versions despite how similar they are, and the newest entries in the main series lineup, Pokemon Sword and Shield, are no exception. With recent trailers emphasizing version differences such as gym leaders, the box art legendary Pokemon, and a double pack which has been advertised as a bundled option for the first time in the series' history, this video aims to answer a question: is it worth buying Pokemon Sword and Shield together, or should you buy them separately? No, there really isn't enough of a reason to buy both Sword and Shield. There just isn't enough differences to make it worth your money, and as much as I love Game Freak, I believe that in 2019 suggesting that we as consumers should buy two near identical games is an extremely predatory way to coax us into giving them more money, especially when you consider that these games are aimed at a young audience that will just eat that kind of stuff up regardless. But see, chances are if you're watching this video, you knew all those things already, so I think it's better to answer that first question in the title with another one. With Sword and Shield in mind, is the concept of having two games inherently greedy, and has the series ever done enough in the past to justify selling two similar versions of the same experience? In this video, I'm going to try to respond to that question by looking back at the history of Pokemon's version exclusives. Now, this isn't going to be an exceedingly comprehensive answer to that question. Candy Eevee already did this, but for literally every single game, including their remakes, and I suggest you'd watch those if you want literally every single difference. This video is more of a broad, analytical take on the question of, can version exclusivity be a good thing, or has Pokemon done version exclusivity well in the past? The original first generation is quite messy as to be expected, but back then nobody was expected to buy these different versions on their own at all. It's been stated many times that friends were supposed to buy the different versions to incentivize trading between the two, and there's clearly been a big shift in mentality there that we'll address later. I think people often underestimate the playground impact that Generation 1 had when looking back. With 151 Pokemon, it was actually quite feasible for a kid to complete the Pokédex through just trading and catching, meaning that the very small amount of version differences between Pokemon Red, Blue, and Green were actually justifiable. Gen 2 naturally expanded upon the concept of version-exclusive Pokemon by setting a series standard for putting them front and center on the box art. That being said, you could actually catch Lugia and Ho-Oh in both games, which is how I think it should have continued to be, barring plot-related exceptions, which I'll get into more with Gen 3. Suicune and Pokemon Crystal also received this spotlight, but irrelevant of that fact, all 5 of the Johto legendaries were available in some form regardless of which game you chose. I think it's interesting how Tajiri's original vision remained throughout the games where he was a director. It's clear that his influence shaped the realizable outcome of being able to catch all of the creatures through sharing with others, but legends and Pokemon that have backstories which are rooted in the mythos of the world and region were still obtainable despite not being prominently featured on the cover of one version of the game. Legendary Pokemon matter a lot more for version exclusives than regular Pokemon for one big reason. As a kid especially, legendary Pokemon are rare, powerful, and honestly something that I can imagine you wouldn't want to trade away. Therefore, if Lugia was locked exclusively to Pokemon Silver, kids would have had less incentive to trade, which would skew the balance in this dual game scheme by making it so that kids would be pushed to buy both versions to have both legendary Pokemon to themselves. Generation 2 thankfully prevented this, and version exclusives remained pertinent, but not over-centralizing in the grand scheme of things. Ruby and Sapphire, in my opinion, did a lot right and a lot wrong when it comes to version exclusives, beginning the turning point in the series' history where I believe that this concept presented a lot of its flaws and where design mentalities began to change. Although I haven't mentioned it before, each Pokemon was resprited in the Generation 1 and 2 games depending on the version. I get that it would have become a scale issue that would have gotten so much worse as the series progressed, but little tweaks like that really brought a level of individuality to each version, and was no doubt something that people looked forward to when purchasing the games for themselves. Unfortunately, that just isn't present here, which I can imagine could make you feel even the slightest bit shortchanged if you bought Ruby and Sapphire back in the day, as a fan who's been with the series since the beginning. Up until this point, I've stressed that there was no strong reason to buy both games, but Ruby and Sapphire actually do a fantastic job of incentivizing buying both for the first time. Whilst the outcomes don't change all that much, the games split heavily throughout as a result of Team Magma and Aqua being the dominant evil force that you must combat depending on your game. Despite this, the legendary Pokemon Groudon and Latios remain exclusive to Ruby, whereas Kyogre and Latias remain locked to Sapphire. I get that in Emerald they fixed this by having them all obtainable through the combination of an expanded post-game story and the Eon Ticket event, but this only drives home the issue that Gen 2 outright avoided. With all of that said, however different these games seem to you, it's clear that moving forward, Game Freak had clearly outlined version differences that made an impact on the player's story and characters, allowing for a better incentive to buy both games. They then followed this up in Generation 4 with absolutely none of that design. Pokemon Diamond and Pearl happen to be the games in the series with the least differences between one another, which is made clear by the fact that both games, unlike Ruby and Sapphire, have an identical story, and both games, unlike Gold and Silver, block the main legendary Pokemon and biggest point of interest behind what is effectively the paywall of a full-price game. Team Galactic remains the force of evil throughout both Pokemon Diamond and Pearl, with the only major difference being that Dialga or Palkia is just there and included in the story, though in the exact same way in both versions. As much as I love Generation 4 since it was my first, it really didn't do a good job of justifying the series' double release deal, especially because of the context surrounding those games. At the time, there were now 493 Pokemon in the National Pokédex, which was an excessive amount for anyone legitimately trying to complete their collection. It's a reason why most people don't even go for that kind of thing nowadays. It just simply wasn't as realizable when compared to earlier generations, which means that the draw of having version-exclusive Pokemon had even less of an impact, even if only for the dwindling number of die-hard collectors. This was the turning point in the series where it strongly became clear that Game Freak wanted us to buy both games, despite having very little differences overall. As with Pokemon Emerald, Sinnoh's own follow-up in Pokemon Platinum does bring the main legendary trio together in a single game, but it also exists as a full-price improvement to the original that came out afterwards, and not as an alternative released at the same time as part of a pair, which is the main reason why they're not worth covering in this instance. Generation 5 initially follows up in previous games' footsteps by locking the main legendary Pokemon to your specific version, Reshiram for Pokemon Black and Zekrom for White, but it at least justifies doing so in the story, where you literally battle the other dragon using your own during the climax of the story versus N. You know what? Good idea. Though more bizarrely, however, this thought wasn't put into the forces of nature that roam Unova. Tornadus and Thundurus are version exclusive, but to catch Landorus it requires that you have both of them in your party to even encounter it. This wrecks any sort of cohesion that Black and White should have had, as it goes above and beyond incentivizing the player to instead borderline force them to buy both games to even get one Pokemon that is still available in one game. Or come to the uncommon option, which involves trading a valuable Pokemon with a friend just so that you can get Landorus in the first place. Even if you do buy both games, this means that you end up getting two Landorus anyway, which just goes to show that this legendary trio felt like slapped in there at the last minute for even the smallest amount of justification. What is especially confusing about all of this is that the version-exclusive Pokemon such as Cottony and Petilil were actually obtainable through in-game trades in the games that they aren't native to. So it's weird that the forces of nature felt so haphazard in their implementation, especially when they managed to get a trio of roaming Pokemon done right over a decade before. Opelucid City differs both visually and musically between Pokemon Black and White, which is a fantastic touch. Granted, there's no real explanation as to why this is, but I think it's important to appreciate the changes here. Despite this, that effort wasn't placed into the gym leaders though. It's nice to see Drayden and Iris be the different gym leaders depending on the version, but it makes next to no gameplay differences as their teams are identical. I can't help but think that this in particular was rushed too. The only difference between their teams are the gender of their Pokemon and their abilities, and since the movesets are identical, Iris's Druddigon having Sheer Force meant literally nothing when none of those moves could even be taken advantage of through that ability. Black City is an area exclusive to Pokemon Black focused on battling, whereas in Pokemon White the same area is replaced with White Forest, which allows for encounters with an extensive amount of version exclusive Pokemon. They're both possibly the most in-depth and greatest version differences in the series' history, even working in tandem with Black and White's Entry-Link feature. So I'm sure this won't surprise you when I say that I believe Pokemon Black and White are the games in the series with the most version differences, though this doesn't make them the most justifiable in that regard, in my opinion. Whilst those features in particular are great, Pokemon Black and White feels like the short end of the stick in a more drastic sense, because in White Forest you'll simply have more Pokemon, which is the more appealing choice here when compared to having high level battles and a few extra items. This isn't exactly Black City's fault, it's just that White Forest offers more to those who care about version differences in the first place, as it provides the player with long-term tangible Pokemon that are exclusive to that version like any other version exclusive Pokemon. With a series designed for catching first and battling second, it's only natural that this would happen. Aside from the typical legendary exclusivity that I won't continue to bring up anymore because I've done it multiple times now and you already get what I'm trying to say, Pokemon Black and White 2 introduced hidden grottos, which had incredibly slight version differences between encounter chances in very specific grottos in the game. This sort of thing had been done with individual routes in previous games, but implementing it in a tiny way to new mechanics is always welcome, even if it doesn't make the Pokemon truly exclusive to one version, it just kinda fiddles with their encounter rates a bit. That being said, Pokemon Black and White 2 really continue to put into question whether version exclusivity is worth it in the first place. On one hand, it makes a positive step forward in changing the puzzles within the Plasma Frigate. A climactic area in the game, being different between versions is a legitimate selling point for both games on the surface. Though, on the other hand, what undermines this is that White Forest and Black City have been renovated to be near identical battle towers, which completely miss the entire point of what made those locations unique and special to begin with in the original Black and White. Smaller things such as trainer placements in very particular routes and even menu colors and UI being switched between versions can't begin to justify the fact that Black and White 2, despite being this far into the series, makes such a poor case for justifying the double game approach Game Freak had kept up for over a decade at this point. Pokemon X and Y are often overlooked because there doesn't seem to be a great deal of version differences on the surface, but that doesn't make the ones that are there any less impactful. Mega Evolution was predominantly featured throughout both X and Y, as well as the Hoenn remakes of Generation 6, and Kalos brought with it an interesting spin on the idea of version exclusivity. Version exclusive Megastones from Pokemon such as Mewtwo, Charizard, Houndoom, or Manectric strike a fantastic middle ground. They're more impactful than your average Pokemon in terms of typical version exclusives, but not as daunting or as polarizing as trading away valuable legendary Pokemon, since they're fairly low commitment, being equipable items for forms that you might not even care about or use. It also is probably the closest we've gotten to version differences that tie into the lore of the region and the mythos, since Ruby and Sapphire's very cataclysmic story, which is fantastic for establishing even the smallest bit of world building in the series. It's also tied into that game's main gimmick, which is good because any sort of variation on a new mechanic makes it just that little bit more interesting and worth more than you might initially think when it comes to version exclusivity. When Sun and Moon rolled around in 2016, I was initially disappointed in the fact that the major selling point in terms of version exclusivity was the fact that Moon's time is inverted by 12 hours. It's a change that can be largely ignored by messing with the 3DS's internal clock yourself, but either way it's not particularly impactful. It does the typical thing of having legendaries exclusive to different versions, but now by trading the lone Cosmog you get in your game, there's actually an incentive to trading version exclusive legendaries without trading your own, which is a nice compromise between how Gold and Silver handled it and the more modern Pokemon games that lock the legendary Pokemon dependent on your version. Even the Ultra Beasts can usually be obtained in multiples, so there's very little loss in sharing your collection with friends that have the other version of the game. I do wish that it experimented a little further with what it had though. Totem Pokemon were one of these game's defining gimmicks, so to see the first Totem fight be dependent on your version, and then to have all of the others remain the same was just a little bit disappointing. Especially when X and Y did a better job of incentivizing version exclusives through its new mechanics just a generation before. Now Ultra Sun and Moon kinda land in the middle when it comes to version exclusivity. Many of the Ultra Wormhole legendaries are exclusive to the different versions, which is fine, but those needed for the Alola Pokédex, the Ultra Beasts, can be caught infinitely this time, which is such a good way of improving on what Sun and Moon had to offer in terms of exclusives. It's far less of a blow when trading these specific Pokemon to other people, though Blacephalon and Stakataka function similarly to how the Ultra Beasts did in the regular Sun and Moon, but that doesn't really matter. Despite changing the Totem Pokemon from from Sun and Moon, and having those Pokemon from Sun and Moon be readily available as totems programmed into the game with their own AI and whatever. I'm actually surprised that they doubled down on keeping the Melee totems version exclusive, but not everyone else. This is especially confusing because of the newly introduced totem stickers in this game, which give you different Pokemon depending on your version, which I appreciate, but why not allow me to fight these Pokemon in the first place if they are readily available to be fought as totems? I'm glad that the post-game stuff, like the Rainbow Rocket episode, has team differences depending on the version, Cyrus having a Dialga and Ultra Sun but a Palkia and Ultra Moon, for example, but it's clear that not even the smallest amount of care was put into that for the main story. The Ultra Recon squad has 2 different members depending on your version, but it doesn't influence the story at all, making their existing impact somehow even more meaningless, which is disappointing because it was specifically showcased as a difference in this game's promotional material. I haven't covered remakes of existing games up until this point because that's simply not what I'm here to analyze. New takes on old regions are great, but they only really double down on the existing version exclusivity that the originals had. But Pokemon Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee, however, are outliers in my opinion. Being based off of Pokemon Yellow, the split into 2 games entirely focused around that split is just done so well. Most of the UI and character interactions are dependent on your version, and I just cannot get enough of it. Pikachu does get the short end of the stick in terms of character customization and his overall abilities as a starter Pokemon, but both starters can be encountered in both games regardless, and I firmly believe that all of these factors concoct a game that I think might be the best in the series when it comes to version exclusives. Even before the games came out, this was the first time that I genuinely had to think about the impact that this would have on the game, which is more than I can say for literally any previous game in the series up until this point. There's definitely a benefit to having a preference, but since you can still obtain both starters in the game either way, Let's Go sets the gold standard in terms of version exclusivity, by having big enough differences whilst not heavily punishing the player because one version is so drastically better than the other. That was kind of a problem that Black and White had, and I don't know, I think Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee really nails it. Finally, we come to Sword and Shield, which obviously isn't out at the time of this video's recording, but I believe it can follow in the footsteps of Let's Go to give us version exclusives that provide a different enough experience without punishing the player for choosing a different version in the first place. This wasn't really worth mentioning beforehand because it was so out of the way and irrelevant, but Sun and Moon actually had Kiawe and Mallow as optional battles post-game depending on the version. However, changing an entire gym is not only reminiscent of that, but an expansion on what Pokemon Black and White initially aimed to do with the Opelucid City gym, though this time the teams, typing, and likely gym layout and gym trainers are all going to be different. Me personally, I'm leaning towards Pokemon Sword, but the fact that I'm already giving this game a decent amount of thought as to which version I choose, it must be a good sign, you know. I haven't done this except with Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee, so I'm very confident that Pokemon Sword and Shield is going to deliver on the version exclusive side of things. That being said, if you're buying Sword and Shield, let me know which version you're going for by telling me in my Discord. It's where I'm most active nowadays after all. Provided no news comes out for Sword and Shield, the next video is gonna smash it out of the park, that's for sure. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys then.